Good evening. Tonight, our story does not begin with the clash of swords or the grandeur of ancient courts. It begins with the hiss of steam and the relentless turning of a wheel, a world of iron, coal, and supposed progress. We are diving deep into what life was truly like in the furnace of the Industrial Revolution. Forget the age of invention the storybook sold you. The truth is, for the millions who built that world, it was not a story of progress, but one of bondage. And you probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in these journeys into the past. And do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always a privilege to know who is joining us from around the world. Now, find a comfortable position, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's chronicle together. To understand the darkness, we must first appreciate the brilliance of the illusion. The year is 1851, and in the heart of London, a miracle of glass and iron has risen from the ground. They call it the Crystal Palace. It is an impossible structure, a cathedral dedicated to a new god called industry, stretching for over a third of a mile and shimmering in the sun. It is the physical embodiment of a nation's supreme self-confidence, a declaration in steel that the Victorian age has arrived, and that humanity has finally, truly, mastered the physical world. Step inside, and you step into a new reality. Before you stands Nasmyth's steam hammer, a titan of engineering with the power to shake the very earth, yet so precise it can be brought down upon a pocket watch without cracking its glass. Over there, the intricate dance of the jacquard looms, weaving complex silk patterns, guided by a series of punched cards, a ghost of the computation that is to come. The electric telegraph clicks and chatters, sending messages across the continent in an instant, annihilating distance and time. This is more than a festival of ingenuity. It is a meticulously crafted narrative of triumph. It is the story of a world made clean, efficient, and orderly through human intellect. This intoxicating sense of power is not confined to this glass house. It thunders across the landscape itself. It is the age of the iron horse. The steam locomotive, a fiery, smoke-breathing beast, carves its way through the countryside. Its shrill whistle, a herald of modernity. The great engineering feats of men like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, bridges that leap across impossible chasms, tunnels that pierce the ancient hills, and a sprawling network of iron tracks that binds the nation together, are not just infrastructure. They are symbols of a new covenant. They proclaim that the chaos of nature is being tamed, replaced by the rigid, reliable, and predictable logic of the timetable. This confidence bleeds into every aspect of life. It is the age of empire, where the map is increasingly painted red. It is an age of perceived societal advancement, of a rising middle class championing the virtues of family, faith, and unrelenting propriety. It is an age of literature that, on its surface, seems to reinforce these ideals of moral certainty and steady progress. The world, from this vantage point, is not just changing, it is improving, marching inexorably, confidently, toward a state of near perfection. But this gleaming vision has a shadow. An engine cannot run without fuel. A palace cannot be built without hands. And the sheer, overwhelming power of this new age had to come from somewhere. Where did the wealth to erect the Crystal Palace truly come from? What fed the insatiable furnaces that gave life to the iron horses? What was the true, unacknowledged fuel for this great engine of progress? Imagine the nation as a grand steamliner, gliding through the waters of history. The passengers stroll the upper decks, admiring the view, basking in the sun, utterly convinced of the vessel's invincible quality. They are not meant to see the engine room. They are not meant to descend into the belly of the ship, into the suffocating heat, the deafening clangor, the choking, oily darkness where filthy, sweat-soaked men shovel coal into a roaring, hellish furnace, their bodies just as much a part of the machine as any piston or gear. The ship moves forward because of the unseen agony in the dark, and so it was with Victorian Britain. In the quiet, gas-lit parlour of a middle-class home, a family might gather around the piano, the world outside a place of order and security. But if they fell silent, if they truly listened, they might hear it. A distant rumble, the percussive, rhythmic thunder of 1,000 power looms, the ceaseless clang of 1,000 hammers. It is the sound of the unseen engine. The first signs of its cost are there for those who choose to see. A persistent pall of smoke on the horizon that dims the sun. A strange, greasy grime that settles on the windowsills, no matter how often they are cleaned. A river that no longer runs clear, its water the colour of slate, its fish long since dead. But these are framed not as warnings, but as the quiet, inevitable, and almost reassuring byproducts of prosperity. This entire vision of progress was a carefully constructed lie. For the millions who built this world, the Victorian age was not an era of progress. It was an era of industrial slavery, pure and simple. The great celebrated engine of the nation was not made of iron and steam. It was made of human flesh and bone. The fuel was not coal. It was the exploited, broken, and utterly disposable lives of men, women, and children. Let us redefine those marvels of the age, those beautiful, intricate textiles that dazzled the world. They were produced by weavers breathing in clouds of cotton dust that would slowly solidify in their lungs, a disease that would suffocate them from the inside out. Their complex patterns were threaded by the nimble fingers of children, many of whom would lose those same fingers, or their hands, or their scalps, to the unguarded gears of the machines they served. The mighty railways are monuments to engineering. They were forged in foundries with non-existent safety, where a single splash of molten metal could mean a gruesome death, and built by armies of labourers who lived in squalor and died in obscurity. The booming cities were not beacons of civilization. They were maps of misery, with elegant squares and grand boulevards, deliberately built to wall off a labyrinth of festering, disease-ridden slums where life was cheap and death was a constant, familiar visitor. This is the story we will tell, not of the inventors and the industrialists, but of the cog in the machine. A story of the absolute tyranny of the factory owner, of the slow death by disease and injury, and of the utter, soul-crushing hopelessness that came from a life lived entirely in the shadow of the mill. The true story of the Industrial Revolution is not found in the museums or the history books. It cannot be measured in miles of track or tons of steel. It is written on the human body. It is written in the stunted growth of children denied sunlight and proper food. It is written in the chronic cough and the soot-blackened lungs of a child sent crawling under a running machine to clear a jam of thread. It is etched into the mangled, shapeless scar tissue of a hand caught and crushed in a loom. Forget the tales of glorious invention and national pride. The true story is heard in the deafening, soul-crushing, relentless roar of the factory floor, a sound that, for millions, was both their master and their tomb. We will not look at the Crystal Palace. We will venture into the furnace that powered it. This is the brutal reality of the Victorian factory worker. Before the tyranny of the clock, there was the rhythm of the sun. For millennia, the life of the overwhelming majority of humanity was governed by a timepiece that hung in the sky. Time was not a line, but a circle. It was the slow turning of the seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon, the arc of the sun from its rising to its setting. Work began when the world grew light enough to see, and it ended when that light failed. The farmer in his field did not measure his day in minutes or hours, but in tasks. There was the time for sowing, the time for reaping, the time for mending a fence or tending to the livestock. It was a life of hard labor, to be sure, a life of uncertainty and often of poverty, but the rhythm of that labor was fundamentally human. The body knew exhaustion, but it also knew the satisfaction of a completed task, the natural pause between efforts, the freedom to look up at the sky and gauge the day. The chiming of the distant church bell marked the hours of prayer, not the units of production. It was a clock that called a community to shared ritual, not a whistle that summoned a workforce to servitude. Time, in this world, was tied to the earth. It was organic. This world was the first casualty of the factory. It was replaced by a new master, one made of iron and steam, and its voice was the factory whistle. It was a sound that ripped through the dawn, sharp, shrill, and utterly indifferent. It was a mechanical scream that cared nothing for the seasons, the sunlight, or the human body's need for rest. It was the sound of a new kind of time being born, a time that was rigid, artificial, and absolute. For those who did not live close enough to hear the whistle, its agent arrived in the dark. He was the knocker-up, a man who made his living by tapping a long pole against the bedroom windows of the workers, a spectral human alarm clock ensuring that no one could escape the summons. The tap on the glass was a promise, not of a new day, but of another shift, identical to the last, stretching into a seemingly infinite future. This new time was relentless. The workday began not with the sun, but in the cold pre-dawn blackness, often at 5 or 5:30 in the morning. And it did not end with the setting of the sun. The new gas lights, hailed as a miracle of the age, were a cruel blessing, for they allowed the factory owners to abolish the night. The shift would grind on for 14, 15, sometimes 16 hours. It would only end long after darkness had reclaimed the world, often at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. This was the norm. Not for a busy period, not for a special order, but the standard, crushing routine, 6 days a week. The breaks offered no true respite. The great steam engine that powered the factory was never turned off. To cool it down and restart it was too expensive. So work might pause for 30 minutes for breakfast, or an hour for dinner, but the workers often remained at their posts. There was no canteen, no break room. They would eat their meager meal, a piece of bread, perhaps some cheese or an oatcake, while sitting on the floor amidst the deafening roar of the machinery. The very food they ate would be coated in a fine layer of cotton dust or metallic filings, a constant internal reminder of the factory's hold. They were ingesting their workplace. An 1832 parliamentary committee heard from one worker who stated simply, "We have no time to be sick." There was no room for anything but the endurance required to survive until the final whistle blew, signaling not freedom, but a brief, exhausted slumber before the torment began anew. This relentless schedule did more than just exhaust the body, it colonized the mind. A new phrase entered the language, championed by the industrialists: time thrift. To them, time was a raw material, a resource to be exploited just like cotton or iron ore. Every second a machine was idle, every moment a worker stood still was a second of lost profit. The worker's time was no longer their own. It was a commodity they had sold, and the owner was determined to extract every last particle of it. The clock on the factory wall was the true overseer. It was more powerful than any human supervisor. It was the ultimate instrument of discipline. The machines had a pace, a relentless mechanical rhythm, and the human operator was forced to become an extension of it. The body had to bend, twist and react in perfect, synchronized time with the churning gears and the flying shuttles. To fall behind the machine's pace was to risk a fine, a beating, or dismissal. And so, the worker's mind, once attuned to the natural world, was now enslaved to the ticking of the clock. They thought in minutes, in the number of pieces produced per hour, in the desperate calculation of how many more hours remained until they could collapse into their bed. The pride of the craftsman, the satisfaction of a job well done, was replaced by the singular, desperate goal of a survivor, to endure. This was the first and most profound violence of the factory system. Before it mangled the body, it shattered the soul's connection to the natural world and shackled it to the tyranny of the clock. If the clock was the mind of the factory, its body was a chaotic jungle of iron. To step onto the factory floor was to leave the world of human scale and enter a new, terrifying dimension engineered for production, not for people. There were no designated walkways, no safety railings, no concept of occupational hazard. The very idea was a foreign language. There was only the machine and the narrow, treacherous spaces in between. The air itself, thick with dust and the smell of hot oil, was a blizzard of power, transmitted by a vast and complex forest of leather belts. These belts, often thick and heavy, snaked from the great steam engine's drive shaft, up to the poorly lit ceiling, and down to every individual machine, a slap-slapping, whining network of exposed, fast-moving parts. They were utterly unguarded, a blur of motion in the gloom, and they were the arteries of this iron beast. A loose piece of clothing, a stray strand of long hair, a moment of inattention could be fatal. In an instant, the belt could snag a worker, yanking them off their feet with incredible force. Witnesses from the era described men being dragged upwards into the overhead shafts to be battered against the ceiling rafters until their bodies came apart, or pulled down into the churning iron guts of the machine they were tending, to be crushed, mangled, or flayed alive. The legal term for such an event was an accident, a word that implies a deviation from the norm. But the danger was so constant, so woven into the fabric of the environment, that these horrors were not deviations. They were an expected, calculated feature of the system. This was a world without safety features. There was no emergency stop button, no protective casing. The machines were designed to run relentlessly, and the idea of interrupting the work of an entire floor, halting the flow of profit because of a single human body, was anathema to the cold logic of the enterprise. The worker learned to move with a strange, constricted grace, a constant, subconscious awareness of the lethal proximity of the flywheels, the pistons, and the gears that were always turning, always hungry. Every movement was a risk, every workday a 13 or 14-hour dance with dismemberment. The floor itself was often slick with oil and water, making a stable footing a luxury. To fall was not just to fall, it was to fall into the machine. Let us look at the power loom, the engine of the textile boom. These machines were crammed together in vast halls, row upon deafening row, with barely enough space for a person to squeeze between them. Its action was a thing of violent, percussive speed. The shuttle, a block of wood, often tipped with metal, holding the weft thread, was the machine's projectile. It was fired back and forth through the warp threads at a blistering, blurry pace. A weaver was responsible for several looms at once, a practice known as tenting. They had to constantly scan the machines, their eyes darting back and forth, looking for the telltale sign of a snapped thread. When one broke, they had to act instantly, darting in to fix it before the flawed cloth accumulated. But sometimes the thread would snap, or the mechanism would jam and the shuttle would be launched out of its track and into the open factory. This was known, with a chillingly casual irony, as the kiss of the shuttle. The wooden missile would fly across the room with enough force to shatter a skull, to knock out teeth, to destroy an eye. The men and women operating the looms worked under the constant threat of this random, brutal assault. Blindness was a common industrial injury. A report from one factory inspector noted a young girl who, struck by a shuttle, had her jaw and cheekbone completely shattered. She was simply carried out. Her loom was tended by another before her blood was even dry on the floor. In the metalworking districts of Sheffield or Birmingham, the danger was different, but no less absolute. Here, the soundtrack was not the clatter of 1,000 looms, but the rhythmic, earth-shaking thump of the metal press, operated by men and, all too often, by children. These machines stamped sheets of metal into uniform shapes for everything from buttons to buckets. The operator's job was to feed the raw material into the press by hand and remove the finished piece, all in the split second that the press was raised. The rhythm had to be perfect. The machine did not wait. Compounding the danger was the rise of piecework, where a worker was paid not by the hour, but by the number of items they produced. This created a direct, desperate financial incentive to work at reckless speeds, to cut corners, to take that one extra risk to feed one's family. A moment's hesitation, a slight fumbling of the fingers, an instant of distraction in the 14th hour of a shift, and the press would descend with crushing, indifferent finality. Losing the tip of a finger was seen as a rite of passage, an expected part of learning the trade. Factory owners considered it a routine, acceptable cost. Foremen would often speak of a worker's value in terms of how many fingers they had left. Losing a whole hand or an entire arm was not uncommon, and when it happened, there was no alarm, no pause. The injured worker, bleeding and in shock, would be dragged away by their fellows. Someone else, perhaps a boy who had just witnessed the horror, would be ordered to take their place. The press did not stop its rhythmic pounding. Even the preparatory processes held their own special horrors. The carding machines, for instance, were used to comb and untangle raw fibers like cotton and wool. They were massive drums covered in thousands of sharp wire teeth. These machines frequently became clogged, and the job of cleaning them fell to the smallest workers, the children. They were forced to clean the machines while they were still running, to avoid the cost of shutting them down. A moment of misjudgment, a sleeve caught on the wires, and a child's arm could be dragged into the machine, to be torn from its socket or shredded down to the bone. The constant, immediate threat of horrific, life-altering injury was simply the price of admission to the factory floor. It was a condition of employment, an unspoken clause in a contract written in the language of fear, and a daily reality that ground down the spirit as surely as the machines ground down the flesh. If the adult worker was treated as a disposable cog in the great machine, the child was something else entirely. They were the machine's preferred fuel. The Industrial Revolution did not invent child labor. Children had always worked on farms and in family workshops, but it perfected its cruelty on a scale never before imagined. It systematized the exploitation of the young, turning their very vulnerability into a source of immense profit. The economic logic was as simple as it was monstrous. A child could be paid a pittance, a mere fraction of an adult's meager wage. Their small size, far from being a disadvantage, was seen as a unique asset, allowing them to crawl into spaces and perform tasks that were impossible for a fully grown man or woman. Their fingers, not yet thickened by years of labor, were considered more nimble, more adept at the delicate work of tying broken threads. And most importantly, they were docile. A child, desperate for the approval of adults and terrified of punishment, could be intimidated into a state of absolute submission. They could be molded by fear into the perfect, uncomplaining worker. This was not a secret, shameful practice hidden in the shadows. It was the bedrock of the entire textile industry, an open and accepted feature of the new economy. Entire families were caught in this vicious trap. A father's wages were often so low that he could not possibly support his family alone. He was forced, by the threat of his own children's starvation, to offer them up to the same factory that was grinding him down. It was a decision that broke the hearts of parents, forcing them to lead their own sons and daughters into the deafening roar of the mill, knowing the dangers that awaited them. The choice was not between work and education, or work and play. The choice was between the factory and the workhouse, or the factory and the grave. The jobs assigned to these children were the most dangerous in the entire factory. Consider the scavenger. This was a role for the smallest children, often as young as 5 or 6. Their task was to crawl on their hands and knees in the narrow space underneath the massive, thundering power looms. Their job was to pick up loose scraps of cotton from the oily floor, a task that had to be performed while the machine was in full, violent operation. They had to flatten their bodies to the ground and time their movements with the sweeping, crushing motion of the heavy wooden carriage as it slid back and forth above their heads. A moment of hesitation, a sleepy miscalculation, and the machine would crush their skull or sever a limb. They spent their entire 14-hour day in this cramped, dark, terrifying space, breathing in the thickest dust, their world reduced to the forest of mechanical legs and the constant, immediate threat of the descending carriage. Slightly older children, perhaps 8 or 9, became pieces. They walked the long alleys between the spinning mules, machines that could be 40 yards long. Their job was to watch the thousands of spinning threads, and when one snapped, they had to lean into the machine and quickly tie the ends back together. This required them to be on their feet for the entire shift, performing the same repetitive, stooping motion for hours on end. The rooms were kept incredibly hot and humid to prevent the threads from becoming brittle, and the children, often barefoot, worked in this suffocating, sweat-drenched atmosphere. The constant leaning and stooping, combined with malnutrition, had a devastating effect on their developing bodies. Their spines began to curve. Their legs grew bowed. They developed chronic, painful deformities that would mark them for the rest of their short lives. This systematic crippling of children was compounded by direct, casual brutality. To keep a child awake and working at pace in the final hours of a shift, the overseer would patrol the aisles with a leather strap or tawse. Children were routinely beaten for being too slow, for making a mistake, or simply for nodding off from sheer, inhuman exhaustion. The evidence for this is not anecdotal. It is meticulously documented in the official parliamentary reports of the era, the so-called Blue Books. These volumes contain thousands of pages of testimony where children describe their lives in their own heartbreaking words. An 8-year-old girl named Sarah Gooder, when asked by a commissioner if she ever got tired, replied, "Yes, at night. I fall asleep at times. They have strapped me, but not so as to hurt me. I have seen the overlooker with a strap in his hand, striking the children." A young boy, when asked about his sister, said, "She was a piecer. She got killed. It was by the shaft. It was her hair that got caught. It lapped her round the shaft, and she was killed." Another, when describing his workday, explained, "We went to the mill at 5 in the morning. We had a half-hour for breakfast and an hour for dinner. We came out at 7 at night. We were strapped. We were strapped very severely." These were not exceptional cases. This was the norm. This was the childhood of a generation. Their growth was stunted by a lack of sunlight and proper food. Their education was non-existent. Their lungs were slowly filling with poison. Their bodies were being twisted and broken by the machines they served. The factory did not just steal their labor, it stole their bodies, their health, their future, and their very childhood itself. It took the most vulnerable members of society and fed them, piece by piece, into the insatiable furnace of progress. There were dangers in the factory that did not crush or tear the flesh in an instant, but instead waged a slow, creeping war of attrition against the body. This was the invisible violence of the environment itself, an assault on the senses so total and so constant that it became a permanent feature of existence, inflicting damage that was often deep and irreversible long before it was ever felt. The first and most overwhelming sensory attack was the sound. To call the factory floor loud is to profoundly misunderstand its nature. It was not a noise, it was a physical force. It was a solid wall of sound, a deafening, percussive roar from hundreds of machines operating at once in a vast, enclosed space, with brick walls and low ceilings that amplified and reflected the din. The clatter of thousands of shuttles, the thunderous pounding of the looms, the high-pitched whine of the spinning frames, and the deep, rhythmic groan of the steam engine's great flywheel, all blended into a single, overwhelming sonic battery. Verbal communication was impossible. A worker could not shout to the person standing next to them and expect to be heard. Over time, they developed a crude sign language, a series of gestures and exaggerated facial expressions, or became adept at lip reading through the gloom. This constant bombardment of sound led inevitably to permanent hearing damage. Workers often described a persistent ringing in their ears that never subsided, a phantom echo of the mill that followed them home and haunted their sleep. By their 20s or 30s, many were already significantly deaf, a condition that only deepened with each passing year. This loss of hearing was more than a physical ailment. It was a profound form of isolation. It cut them off from their families, from the chatter of their own children, from the simple human connection of a shared conversation. They lived in a world first of overwhelming noise and then of encroaching, lonely silence. If the noise was an assault on the ears, the air itself was a poison to the lungs. In the textile mills, the conditions were deliberately manipulated to be hot and humid, as this prevented the cotton threads from becoming brittle and snapping. Windows were kept closed, and ventilation was non-existent, as it would interfere with this carefully controlled microclimate. The air, therefore, was thick and stagnant, saturated with the fine, almost invisible dust of raw cotton. It coated every surface, clinging to the machines, to the workers' clothes, to their skin and hair. And with every breath, for 14 hours a day, they drew this particulate matter deep into their lungs. This led to an occupational disease so common it was known simply as mill fever. Today it is called bisonosis, or brown lung disease. Its progression was predictable and cruel. A new worker might first notice a tightness in their chest and a persistent cough, symptoms that were often worse on a Monday after a day of rest away from the dust. This was Monday fever. As the weeks and months went on, this tightness would last longer into the week, until eventually it never subsided at all. The cotton dust, accumulating in the lungs, caused chronic inflammation and obstruction of the airways. The body's own immune response would lead to a gradual scarring and hardening of the lung tissue. Over the course of years, this progressed to a state functionally identical to emphysema. Breathing became a conscious, painful effort. Victims were left unable to walk across a room without gasping for air, their lives ending in a slow, agonizing suffocation. This atmospheric poison was not unique to the textile industry. In the iron foundries, the air was a thick, acrid smog of soot, metal dust, and toxic fumes. The process of smelting and casting iron released clouds of carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide. The grinding and polishing of finished metal products filled the air with sharp, abrasive particles that settled in the lungs, leading to silicosis, a disease that turned lung tissue into hardened, rock-like nodules. In the potteries, dust from the clay and glazes, which often contained lead, caused both respiratory failure and severe neurological damage. In every corner of the new industrial world, the very air that was meant to give life was instead a carrier of disease and death. The factory's claim on the worker's body was therefore absolute. It did not matter if one managed to avoid the instant, violent death of being caught in the machinery. It did not matter if one kept all of their fingers. The factory had other, slower, more patient ways of killing. The roar of the mill would eventually take your hearing, and the air you breathed, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, would inevitably take your life. It was a deferred death sentence, but one that was almost certain to be carried out. The physical brutality of the factory, the daily risk of mutilation and the slow poisoning of the air was underpinned by a system of control so absolute and so meticulous that it constituted its own form of invisible violence. To enter the factory gates was to leave the jurisdiction of the crown and the laws of the land. It was to cross a border into a private fiefdom, a sovereign state in miniature, where the mill owner was the absolute monarch, and his will was the only law that mattered. This was not a system of employment as we would understand it today. It was a system of total subjugation, enforced by a complex architecture of rules, punishments, and financial penalties designed to crush the will and ensure perfect, unquestioning obedience. The very air inside the walls seemed different, heavy with a sense of judgment and the constant, unspoken threat of transgression. Upon the factory wall, often near the entrance where every worker would be forced to pass it each morning, a list of these rules would be posted. It was a formal declaration, often printed in stark black letters on a board stained with grease and grime, a veneer of legality for what was, in practice, pure tyranny. The list was long, and the infractions it detailed were often breathtaking in their pettiness, a testament to a philosophy that viewed the worker not as a human being, but as a faulty component in need of constant, punitive correction. A worker could be fined for being 2 minutes late. They could be fined for being caught speaking to their neighbor on the line, the assumption being that any conversation, no matter how brief, was a theft of the owner's precious time. They could be fined for whistling, an act of levity that was seen as an affront to the grim seriousness of production. Fines were levied for leaving a window open without permission, for having a dirty workspace, for wasting raw materials by dropping scraps on the floor. A worker could be fined for taking too long to get a drink of water from the communal tap, or for using the privy outside of the designated infrequent breaks, a rule that led to constant discomfort and humiliation. The rules followed them into every corner of their workday, a dense web designed to be impossible not to break. In some textile mills, a worker who produced a piece of cloth with even a minor flaw, a snapped thread, a slight imperfection in the weave, would not only be fined, but could also be forced to purchase the flawed item themselves at its full retail price. This was a particularly cruel and common twist of logic. A worker, paid a pittance to create a product, could end their week in debt to the owner for the very item their exhausting labor had produced. The flaw was seen as a moral failing, and the punishment was both financial and deeply personal. These fines were not just a tool for discipline, they were a significant and reliable source of revenue for the owner, a secondary stream of income extracted directly from the workforce. Let us consider the brutal calculus. An adult male worker in a mill might earn, with great effort, 7 or 8 shillings for a 60-hour week of relentless toil. A fine for being 5 minutes late could be a shilling. A fine for being caught with an open window could be a shilling. A fine for a flaw in a piece of cloth could be a shilling. With just 2 or 3 minor, often unavoidable infractions, a worker could lose more than a quarter of their entire weekly income. The wage was not a fixed sum to be earned. It was a theoretical maximum, a target that was constantly being whittled away, a carrot that was perpetually being pulled back. Workers would describe the despair of receiving their pay packet at the end of the week, only to find it drastically lighter than expected, their incredible efforts undone by a series of arbitrary, merciless deductions against which there was no appeal. When fines were not enough, especially when dealing with children and young women who had the least power to resist, the punishment became physical. The primary instrument of this enforcement was the tawse, or the strap. This was a heavy leather strap, sometimes with its ends split to inflict a sharper sting, and it was wielded by the overseers with impunity. Its presence was a constant threat. A child caught dozing at their post in the 14th hour of their shift would be woken not by a gentle shake, but by a sharp blow from the strap across their back or legs. The sound of the leather striking flesh would momentarily rise above the din of the machinery, a signal to all nearby workers to redouble their efforts. A young woman deemed to be working too slowly would be struck across the back to encourage her pace. This was not considered abuse in the modern sense. It was simply a tool of production, a method for extracting the maximum possible effort from an exhausted human body, as logical to the overseer as oiling a machine. The cruelty could also be psychological, designed to inflict maximum humiliation and serve as a warning to others. A common punishment for a child who made a mistake was to have the flawed product, the tangled yarn, the imperfectly stamped button, hung around their neck. They became a living scarecrow, a badge of their own failure, forced to endure the stares and the scorn of their fellows for the rest of the day. For more serious offences, like repeated drowsiness or a perceived insolence, a child might be forced to wear heavy weights, shackled to their ankles as they tried to work, or be made to stand on a stool in a corner for hours. Some of the most brutal overseers practiced what was known as cisterning. A child who had fallen asleep would be picked up, carried to the water cistern used for washing the machinery, and submerged in the cold, foul-smelling, and often slimy water. The shock to the system was a violent, terrifying way to wake them, but the cruelty did not end there. The child would then be forced to work for the remainder of their shift in their soaking, freezing clothes, their misery a stark and shivering warning to every other child on the floor. This regime of constant surveillance, financial penalty, and physical punishment created a climate of pure, unadulterated fear. The worker was trapped. Their body was assaulted by the machines and the air, and their spirit was assaulted by a system designed to strip them of their autonomy, their dignity, and their hope. This was the law of the iron fist, and there was no court of appeal. The factory owner's power extended far beyond the factory walls. For many workers, it followed them home, controlled what they ate, and dictated how they lived. This was achieved through a simple but insidious system of economic bondage, known as the truck system. It was a method of payment designed to create a closed loop, a financial trap from which escape was nearly impossible, ensuring that the worker remained perpetually dependent on the master. In many industrial communities, particularly those in more isolated rural areas where a new mill might be the only source of employment for miles around, workers were not paid in the official currency of the realm. They were not paid in shillings and pence that could be spent anywhere. Instead, at the end of a long, hard week, they were paid in scrip, tommy, or truck, vouchers, tokens, or credit notes issued by the factory owner himself. These notes had no value outside the narrow confines of the owner's economic empire. They were, in effect, a private currency recognized in only one place, the company store. This institution, often called the Tommy shop, was a critical component of the trap. It was, of course, owned by the factory owner. In many of these company towns, it was the only store available. It sold everything a worker's family might need to survive: flour, bread, tea, candles, soap, cloth, and perhaps some low-quality meat. And it was the only place where the company's scrip was accepted. The worker, holding a week's wages in worthless tokens, had no choice but to shop there. They were a captive customer. This monopoly was ruthlessly exploited. The prices at the company store were grossly inflated, often 20, 30, or even 40% higher than they would be in a competitive open market. A pound of flour that might cost a shilling in the nearby city would cost a shilling and sixpence at the Tommy shop. The quality of the goods was also notoriously poor. Flour was often bulked out with chalk dust. Tea was padded with dried leaves from other plants. The scales used for weighing goods were rumored to be inaccurate. The worker was thus caught in a double bind, forced to use their wages to buy overpriced, substandard goods from the very man who had paid them. A significant portion of the wages they had just earned flowed immediately and inevitably back into the pocket of the factory owner. It was a masterpiece of circular exploitation. The system was designed to ensure that a worker could never get ahead. The wages were set low and the prices were set high, creating a narrow and often impassable channel between income and expenditure. If a family faced an unexpected expense, a sick child needing medicine, a worn-out pair of shoes needing replacement, their weekly scrip would not be enough to cover it. In this event, the company store owner, often the factory owner or his direct agent, would graciously extend them credit. He would allow them to take the goods now against their future earnings. This extension of credit was the final link in the chain. From that moment on, the worker was no longer just an employee. They were a debtor. A portion of their future earnings was already owed to the master before they had even worked for it. This debt would be meticulously recorded in the company ledger, often accruing interest, ensuring that it was nearly impossible to ever fully repay. A worker might spend years, even a lifetime, trying to clear a debt that was incurred in a single week of hardship. This state of indebtedness became a powerful tool of control. A worker who was in debt to the company store could not quit their job. To leave would be to abscond on a debt, a criminal offense that could land them in prison. They were bonded to the factory not just by their need for a wage, but by a legal and financial obligation they could never hope to escape. The truck system was, in essence, a modern form of serfdom, perfectly adapted for the industrial age. It bound the worker to the master's land and the master's enterprise, not through feudal oaths, but through the sophisticated and inescapable mathematics of debt. It ensured a stable, immobile workforce and created a second layer of profit for the owner, extracted from the worker not as a laborer, but as a consumer. It was a quiet, bureaucratic form of tyranny that held entire communities in its grasp, ensuring that the fruits of their incredible labor would never lead to their own prosperity, but only deepen their dependence and enrich the man who held the ledger. Trapped by the tyranny of the clock, the dangers of the machine, and the economic bondage of the truck system, the worker had one final, desperate hope: their own voice. Yet this too was systematically silenced. The architects of the Industrial Revolution, men celebrated for their ingenuity and foresight, understood a fundamental truth. While a single worker was powerless, a united workforce could pose a genuine threat to their absolute authority. They therefore constructed an impenetrable wall of silence around their factories, a fortress of intimidation and legal oppression, ensuring that any whisper of protest, any murmur of dissent, would be immediately and ruthlessly crushed. For an individual worker, the simple act of complaint was a form of professional suicide. Imagine a man pushed beyond the limits of his endurance. Perhaps his child has been beaten by an overseer, or he has seen his weekly pay docked by a series of unjust fines for the third week in a row. He feels the burning indignation, the sense of profound injustice. He might spend a sleepless night wrestling with his fear, knowing the risks, but finally resolving that he must speak. He approaches the overseer, cap in hand, his heart pounding. He tries to explain his grievance, his voice trembling, trying to sound reasonable and not accusatory. He is not met with a discussion. He is met with a cold stare, a sneer, and a verdict. He is a troublemaker, an agitator. There was no grievance process, no appeal to a higher authority. The overseer's word was law. The man would be summarily dismissed, cast out from the factory gates, his meager belongings often thrown out into the muddy street after him. But the punishment did not end at the gate. It followed him like a shadow. The owners of the mills and factories in a given district were a small, tightly knit fraternity. They might be rivals in business, but they were allies in the subjugation of labor. They shared a common interest, the maintenance of a cheap and docile workforce. When a troublemaker was fired from one mill, his name would be entered into a ledger. This was the blacklist, a document more powerful than any court judgment. Sometimes it was a formal, circulating list. More often, it was a gentleman's agreement, a quiet word passed over a glass of port at the local gentleman's club. The man's name and description would be circulated among all the other employers in the region. When he went, cap in hand, to the next factory, his hope rekindled. He would be met with a shake of the head. When he went to the one after that, the same. The doors of every potential employer would be closed to him. The blacklist was a sentence of industrial excommunication. It meant that a man, for the crime of speaking out, could be rendered unemployable, condemning not just himself, but his entire family to destitution and the grim sanctuary of the workhouse. This ever-present threat was a powerful enforcer of silence. It was better to suffer any injustice, any hardship, than to risk the starvation of one's children. Recognizing the futility of individual protest, some brave workers tried to organize, but the owners knew that the real danger lay in collective action. Therefore, the full weight of the state and the law was brought to bear against any attempt to bargain collectively. The Combination Acts, enforced during the crucial early decades of industrialization, made it explicitly illegal for workers to form combinations, what we would now call trade unions. The simple act of gathering together to peacefully ask for better pay or safer conditions was redefined by the law as a criminal conspiracy, an act tantamount to rebellion. Early union organizers were hunted men. They met in secret, in darkened alehouses or on remote moors, speaking in whispers, knowing that a spy from the factory owner could be among them. If caught, they were arrested, tried by magistrates who were often the factory owners themselves, and could be sentenced to long terms in prison or, in some cases, transportation to penal colonies like Australia, a fate many considered worse than death. Even after these draconian acts were repealed, the factory owners had countless other weapons at their disposal. If workers dared to strike, the owners would hire private armies of thugs and strikebreakers, often desperate men from other districts, to physically assault and intimidate the men on the picket lines. Pitched battles outside the factory gates were not uncommon. If the striking workers lived in company-owned housing, which many did, they and their families would be summarily evicted. The owner's agents would arrive without warning, throwing their meager furniture and belongings into the street, leaving them both jobless and homeless in a single brutal stroke. If a strike was particularly large or effective, the owner could appeal to the local magistrates, who would not hesitate to call in the yeomanry, the local militia, or even the regular army. Time and time again, peaceful protests for bread and dignity were met with violent force. The infamous Peterloo Massacre of 1819 in Manchester, where cavalry charged a crowd of 60,000 peaceful protesters, killing over a dozen and injuring hundreds, was the most notorious example. But it was part of a wider pattern of state-sanctioned violence against the working class. Ultimately, the greatest weapon in the owner's arsenal, more powerful than the blacklist or the army, was the simple, brutal reality of supply and demand. The Industrial Revolution had coincided with massive social upheaval in the countryside. Families were being pushed off the land by enclosure acts and agricultural mechanization. They were flooding into the new industrial cities in a desperate, relentless tide. This created a vast, captive pool of surplus labor. For every worker toiling inside the factory, there were dozens more standing outside the gates. Every morning, a crowd of them would gather, their faces thin with hunger, their clothes ragged, their eyes filled with a desperate hope. They were a constant, visible reminder of every worker's disposability. This surplus of humanity rendered any individual, and even small groups, utterly replaceable. The owner could fire his entire workforce in the morning and have a new, even more desperate and compliant workforce hired by the afternoon. This constant looming presence of the unemployed created a fierce, internal competition among the workers themselves, undermining solidarity and reinforcing the culture of fear. To protest was not just to risk your own job. It was to know with absolute certainty that another starving man was ready and waiting to step into your place. This was the final lock on the cage. The wall of silence was absolute. Pacing the narrow, treacherous alleys between the roaring machines was a figure who embodied the owner's absolute authority. He was the human face of the iron fist, the living instrument of the factory's oppressive will. He was the overseer or the foreman. His role was not simply to manage production or ensure quality. His primary function was to enforce the system, to serve as the master's eyes and ears, and to maintain a constant, suffocating pressure on the workforce. His very presence was a weapon, a perpetual reminder to every worker that they were being watched, judged, and found wanting. The overseer was a man caught in the middle, a fact that did nothing to soften his cruelty. Rather, it often amplified it. He was himself an employee, subject to the owner's relentless demands for ever-increasing output and efficiency. His own job security, his ability to feed his own family, depended entirely on his ability to push the workers under his command to their absolute physical and mental limits. An owner did not measure an overseer's success by the morale of his workers, but by the cold, hard numbers on a ledger. This created a dynamic where cruelty became a professional requirement, a key performance indicator. An overseer who was seen as too lenient, too soft on the workers, who failed to use the fine and the strap to extract every last drop of effort, would soon find himself out of a job, replaced by a man more willing to embrace the necessary brutality of the role. Consequently, the men who thrived as overseers were often of a particular type. Some were former workers themselves, men who had managed to claw their way up by demonstrating a ruthless ambition and a willingness to betray their fellows. They knew every trick, every shortcut, and every sign of slacking because they had once practiced them themselves, and they policed them now with the zeal of a convert. Others were men who simply relished the taste of power, however minor. In a world where they were nobodies, the factory floor was their kingdom, and they ruled it with a petty despotism that compensated for their own insignificance outside its walls. He would patrol the factory floor relentlessly, his footsteps a familiar, dreaded sound on the grimy, vibrating floorboards. He did not walk, he prowled. His gaze would sweep across the workers, a predator's scan, not just looking, but hunting for any sign of weakness or defiance. He watched for the slightest drooping of the eyelids, a sign of the sleep that was a constant, tempting enemy. He watched for the slightest slowing of the hands, a signal that a body was nearing its breaking point. He listened for the forbidden sound of a whispered conversation, straining to catch it beneath the roar of the machines. He would loom over a worker's shoulder, his shadow falling across their station, saying nothing, his silent presence a more potent threat than any shouted order. He would inspect the finished work with a hypercritical eye, holding it up to the dim gaslight, searching for any flaw, any imperfection that could justify a fine and reinforce his dominance. He was the accuser, the judge, and the jury in this makeshift courtroom, and his verdict was always final. This constant surveillance created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion that poisoned the very air. Workers were afraid to make eye contact with each other, lest it be misinterpreted as idle conversation. They learned to perform their tasks with a frantic, nervous energy whenever the overseer was near, a state of heightened anxiety that was physically and mentally exhausting to maintain for 14 hours a day. The psychological toll of being perpetually watched, of knowing that your livelihood and the well-being of your family depended on never making a mistake or showing a moment of human frailty, was immense. It followed them home, infecting their brief hours of rest with a lingering anxiety. It fostered a sense of profound isolation, turning worker against worker. A word of complaint to a fellow could be overheard and reported to the overseer in an attempt to curry favor, to gain a moment's reprieve from his wrath. There could be no trust, no solidarity on the factory floor, only a shared, silent dread of attracting the overseer's gaze. He was the conduit for the system's brutality. It was his hand that wielded the strap, his voice that announced the fines, his finger that pointed to the worker who was to be dismissed. He was often the one who had to inform a family that their child had been mangled in a machine, an act he would perform with a callous indifference that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the era, treating the loss of a human life as little more than a minor interruption to production. He was the one who would grab a drowsy child by the ear and drag them to the water cistern for a dose of discipline. In essence, his job was to dehumanize the workers under his charge, to strip them of their names and identities, and see them only as units of production, as components of the machinery that could be threatened, beaten, and fined into a state of maximum efficiency. This figure, pacing in the gloom of the factory, is crucial to understanding the lived experience of the worker. He was more than just a manager. He was the personification of the system's cold, inhuman logic. The owner might be a distant, almost mythical figure, seen only when arriving at the factory in his fine carriage, a man from another universe. But the overseer was there, a constant, menacing presence. He was the daily, hourly embodiment of the worker's powerlessness. To look at him was to see the merciless calculus of the industrial age made flesh. He was the cog that was tasked with breaking the will of all the other cogs, the tragic, twisted agent of a cruel system who ensured that the great, profitable machine never, ever stopped turning. The factory was more than a place of work. It was an ecosystem of disease. It was an environment perfectly engineered to first systematically dismantle the human body's natural defenses, and then to expose the weakened host to a relentless barrage of pathogens. The great myth of the Victorian age was that progress was conquering nature, but inside the factory walls, a far more ancient and intimate battle was being waged, and nature, in the form of microscopic organisms, was winning a slow, brutal, and undeclared war against the industrial workforce. The process began with a systematic weakening of the host. An effective immune system, the body's private army against invasion, is a luxury. It requires a surplus of energy, a steady supply of nutrients, and adequate periods of rest to build and maintain its forces. The factory worker had none of these. The 14 or 16-hour workday did not just cause exhaustion, it induced a state of chronic, deep-seated depletion. The body was in a constant state of energy deficit, with no opportunity to properly rest, repair, and regenerate. Every ounce of fuel was burned simply to survive the shift, leaving nothing in reserve to fight off illness. This physical exhaustion was compounded by severe malnutrition. The diet of the average worker was monotonous and meager, consisting largely of bread, potatoes, and weak tea. Fresh vegetables, fruit, and meat were rare luxuries. This wasn't just about a lack of calories. It was about a catastrophic lack of the essential vitamins and minerals needed for immune function. A body starved of vitamin C cannot properly form connective tissue, leaving it vulnerable. A body without sufficient protein cannot manufacture the antibodies needed to identify and destroy invading bacteria. The worker's body was, in essence, a defenseless city, its walls crumbling and its gates left wide open. They walked into the factory each morning already defeated, their systems primed for opportunistic infection. And the factory was a perfect hothouse for that infection to bloom. Of all the diseases that ravaged the 19th century, one reigned supreme. It was known as consumption, or the White Plague. Today, we call it tuberculosis. It was an airborne disease, passed from person to person through microscopic droplets released by coughing or sneezing. And the factory floor was perhaps the most efficient machine for its transmission ever invented. Picture the scene. Hundreds of people are crammed together into a vast, enclosed room. The windows are nailed shut to maintain the hot, humid atmosphere required for the cotton threads. The air is stagnant, thick with dust and recycled breath. In this environment, a single worker with an active tuberculosis infection, a man or woman whose own weakened body has allowed a dormant infection to become a raging disease, is a biological time bomb. Every cough, a reflex made constant by the need to clear their dust-clogged lungs, releases a cloud of highly infectious mycobacteria into the air. These droplets do not dissipate. They hang in the thick, unmoving atmosphere for hours to be inhaled by every other person in the room. Each breath taken was a gamble, a sip from a poisoned chalice. The factory was not just a place of work, it was a giant man-made lung, concentrating and then distributing the plague with unparalleled efficiency. The danger was not just airborne. The great killers of the Victorian slum, cholera and typhoid, did not remain confined to the overcrowded tenements. They followed the workers through the factory gates. The source of these diseases was contaminated water, water tainted with human waste. The factory owners, in their relentless pursuit of profit, saw no reason to provide such amenities as clean drinking water or proper sanitation for their workforce. A single communal tap, often drawing from a questionable source, might serve hundreds of workers. The privies were few, foul, and often little more than pits that could contaminate the surrounding groundwater. A worker arriving from a slum where a cholera outbreak was beginning could carry the bacteria on their unwashed hands. Using the communal tap, they could transfer the bacteria to its handle, infecting every person who used it after them. Sharing a piece of food, a cup, or simply working in close proximity was enough. In the close, Unhygienic confines of the workplace, with no facilities for hand washing and no understanding of germ theory, an outbreak could sweep through a factory with terrifying speed. The factory, therefore, acted as a central hub, a great crossroads of pestilence. It gathered the sick and the vulnerable, concentrated the diseases of the air and the water in one place, and ensured that no one could escape exposure. Progress, it turned out, had a sound, and it was the sound of 1,000 people coughing. The slow death by disease was a constant creeping terror, but it was the prospect of sudden, violent injury that occupied the workers' most immediate fears. The threat of the machine was absolute and ever present. Chapter 1 explored this as a constant danger, a psychological weight. But to truly understand the brutal reality, we must move beyond the threat and witness the moment of impact. We must look directly at what happened when the chaotic dance between human flesh and iron gears went wrong. This is the reality of the accident, a story written not in ledgers or reports, but in blood and bone. The accounts of these incidents, drawn from hospital records, inquest reports, and the testimony of horrified witnesses, are unflinching in their gruesomeness. Consider the degloving injury, a common horror in factories using rollers for pressing cloth or metal. A worker's hand, caught for a split second, would be pulled into the machine. The rollers would not crush the bone. Instead, they would grip the skin and soft tissue, pulling it clean off the hand and forearm as if removing a glove. The worker would be left with a skeletal, blood-drenched limb, the muscles and tendons exposed to the grimy air. In the carding rooms, where the massive drums covered in sharp wire teeth combed the raw cotton, the most feared accident was being pulled in entirely. A child, ordered to clean the machine while it was still running, might get a piece of their clothing caught. In an instant, they would be dragged into the unforgiving mechanism. The wire teeth, designed to tear apart tangled fibers, would do the same to the human body. The machine would not stop. Its rhythmic turning would continue, with the child's body being torn to pieces within its iron frame, until all that was left to be retrieved was a horrifying, unrecognizable mass. Witnesses described the sudden, sharp scream, followed by a sickening, wet, crunching sound that would be briefly audible over the regular noise of the mill. Then, silence from the victim as the machine continued its work. In the great bleaching and dyeing works, another kind of horror awaited. Workers toiled on narrow, slippery wooden planks, suspended over huge open vats, some of which were filled with boiling water, others with caustic chemicals like sulfuric acid or chlorine bleach. A slip on the wet wood was common. To fall was to be boiled alive, or to be subjected to a chemical burning so severe that the flesh would dissolve from the bone. The vats were often so large and the fumes so overwhelming that retrieval was impossible. The worker was simply consumed. When these moments of violence occurred, there was no protocol, no plan, no mercy. The factory floor would erupt into a brief moment of chaos and panic. There was no first aid kit on the wall, no designated medic to be summoned. Fellow workers, many of them children themselves, would rush to the victim, attempting to stop the catastrophic bleeding with their own dirty aprons or scraps of cotton from the floor, often making the inevitable infection worse. But their efforts were secondary to the primary concern of the overseer, the machine. His first priority was not the mangled human being lying on the floor, but the swift restoration of production. If a body was caught in the gears, the most urgent task was to untangle it, not to save a life, but to get the machine running again. The human victim was an obstruction, a jam in the mechanism that had to be cleared. An order would be shouted, "Get him out of the way! Get the machine going!" If the accident was fatal, The process was even more grimly efficient. A worker decapitated by a snapping drive belt that wrapped around their neck. A man crushed flat by a falling piece of machinery during repairs. A child who slipped and fell into an open pit of gears beneath the floorboards. In these cases, the machine had won. The body, or what was left of it, would be dragged to a corner of the factory and covered with a piece of sacking. It would lie there, in the dust and the din, until the end of the shift, a silent, lumpen testament to the day's events. Only then would it be carted away. A replacement worker, often plucked from the crowd waiting at the gates, would have taken their place at the machine long before the body was cold. The factory consumed its victims, and the system was designed to absorb these losses without ever pausing, without ever missing a beat in its relentless, profitable rhythm. The moment of impact was a flash of red, a brief sharp scream swallowed by the roar of the mill. But for those who survived this initial violence, their ordeal was only just beginning. The end of the accident marked the beginning of a new, slower, and in many ways, more cruel form of suffering. To be maimed by the factory was to be fundamentally changed in the eyes of the industrial world. It was to be reclassified instantly from a human asset to a human burden. The factory, having taken a limb, an eye, or a person's health, had no further use for what remained. A worker who had been catastrophically injured was not seen as a patient to be cared for, but as a broken tool to be discarded. Imagine the scene. A man, his arm now a mangled stump, is carried home by his fellow workers after the overseer has made it clear he is no longer welcome on the factory floor. They lay him on his cot in the single damp room that houses his entire family. And that is where the employer's responsibility ends. There would be no follow-up visit, no offer of medical assistance, no inquiry into his well-being. The wages that were his family's lifeline would cease immediately. He was, from that moment on, forgotten by the system that had broken him. The bond of employment was severed at the exact moment the worker needed it most. For the disabled worker, this abandonment was a sentence of lifelong poverty, a fall from which there was no recovery. In a world that valued only a body's capacity for physical labor, a man with one arm, a woman with a crippled leg, or a child blinded in one eye was rendered useless. They could not operate the machinery, could not keep the pace. There were no lighter duties to be assigned, no concept of accommodating a disability. The relentless demand for able-bodied workers meant that the maimed were simply pushed to the margins of society, to live or to die as fate decreed. This personal tragedy invariably became the ruin of an entire family. In an era before any form of social safety net, the male worker was often the primary, and sometimes the only, source of income. His injury meant that the family's slender financial lifeline was cut. They would quickly burn through any meager savings they might have had. They would sell their few possessions. But starvation was a patient and relentless enemy. The pressure would then fall upon the rest of the family. The wife would be forced to seek whatever work she could find, often in the most exploitative, sweated trades, like piecework sewing by candlelight late into the night for a pittance. More tragically, the disabled father would have to watch as his own children were sent into the very factory that had crippled him, often at an even younger age, to try and make up for his lost income. The cycle of industrial injury would thus perpetuate itself, the ruin of one generation feeding the exploitation of the next. If no work could be found, the family's only remaining option was the dreaded workhouse. This was not a place of charity, but a prison for the poor, designed to be as unpleasant as possible, to deter people from seeking its shelter. Families were torn apart upon entry, the husband sent to one wing, the wife to another, the children to a third. To enter the workhouse was to lose one's family, one's freedom, and one's final shred of dignity. It was a fate so feared that many disabled workers chose to beg on the streets instead, their mutilated bodies a silent testament to the price of progress. Throughout all this suffering, the idea of compensation was an absurdity. There was no concept of employer liability, no disability payments, no legal recourse whatsoever. In the rare event that an accident was investigated by a coroner's court, the verdict was almost universally the same: accidental death, with the blame implicitly placed on the worker's own carelessness. The legal and philosophical framework of the time was built on the principle that a worker, by accepting a job, also accepted all the risks inherent within it. The possibility of being maimed was simply part of the unwritten contract. To suggest that an owner should be financially responsible for the human wreckage his factory created was seen as a radical, absurd, and dangerous notion. It was an idea that, in the minds of the powerful, threatened the very foundations of industry and profit. The law was a tool to protect property, and the machines were valuable property. The worker, on the other hand, was replaceable and had no legal claim. And so, the survivors of the factory's violence were left to carry the full burden of their fate alone, their broken bodies a constant, painful reminder of a world that had used them, shattered them, and then thrown them away without a second thought. The factory waged a war on multiple fronts. It battered and broke the body, but it also laid siege to the mind. For those who navigated the daily gauntlet of physical dangers, who avoided both the sudden trauma of the machine and the slow suffocation of the poisoned air, there was another, more insidious kind of corrosion at play. This was the damage done to the human spirit, a psychological wounding that, for many, was the most painful burden of all. The noise, the danger, the exhaustion, and the utter hopelessness of their situation created a cumulative pressure that could crush the soul as effectively as any iron press. Imagine the mental state of a worker at the end of a 14-hour shift. Their ears are ringing. Their muscles ache with a fatigue so deep it feels embedded in their bones. Their mind, forced into a state of hypervigilance for hours on end, is frayed and raw. They walk home through the dark, filthy streets to a crowded, airless room, knowing that in just a few short hours, the entire ordeal will begin again. There is no prospect of advancement, no hope of escape. Tomorrow will be the same as today, and the year after will be the same as this one. This was not just a life of hardship. It was a life without a future. This crushing weight of hopelessness manifested as a pervasive collective despair that was noted by many observers of the era. Doctors, social reformers, and even some politicians who toured the industrial districts wrote of the blank, listless, and joyless expressions they saw on the faces of the workers. They described a spiritual exhaustion that went even deeper than their physical fatigue. This was not simple sadness. It was the profound soul sickness that comes from a life devoid of autonomy, beauty, or meaning. What we would now recognize as a state of chronic, severe depression. The vibrant, chaotic energy of human life was being systematically ground down into a state of dull, listless endurance. This underlying depression was compounded by the acute trauma of what they were forced to witness. The human mind is not designed to accommodate the regular spectacle of horrific violence. Yet the factory worker was forced to see their friends, their neighbors, and sometimes their own family members killed or mutilated in front of them. They would see a young girl's scalp torn off when her hair was caught in a belt. They would see a man's arm crushed to a pulp in a set of gears. They would hear the scream, see the blood, and then be ordered to continue working as if nothing had happened, often right beside the spot where the horror had occurred. These images did not simply disappear. They became ghosts that haunted the mind. The memory of these events would surface without warning, a sudden intrusive flashback in the middle of the night, a waking nightmare that brought back the sights, the sounds, and the smells of the accident with perfect, horrifying clarity. In modern terms, many workers were suffering from a severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the 19th century, there was no language for this condition, no concept of psychological trauma. There was no therapy, no counseling, no outlet for the terror they carried within them. They were expected to be as resilient as the iron machines they tended, to simply absorb the horror and continue to function. Faced with this intolerable reality, the physical pain, the mental exhaustion, the haunting memories, and the absolute lack of hope, many workers turned to the only escape that was readily available. They turned to alcohol. The rise of the Industrial Revolution was mirrored by the rise of the gin palace. These establishments, with their bright gaslights and ornate mirrors, were a stark contrast to the grim squalor of the workers' lives, and they offered a cheap, potent, and temporary oblivion. This turn to drink should not be seen as a simple moral failing. It was, for many, a rational, if tragic, response to an unbearable existence. For the price of a few pennies, a glass of cheap gin could do what nothing else could. It could momentarily dull the chronic pain in their joints and muscles. It could soften the sharp edges of their traumatic memories. It could silence the constant ringing in their ears, and for a few precious hours grant them a brief, hazy respite from the crushing despair of their lives. It was a form of self-medication, an attempt to treat an illness of the soul in the only way they knew how. This self-destruction was, for many, the only form of agency they had left, in a life where every moment was controlled by the factory owner. The choice to drink oneself into oblivion was a final, desperate act of personal freedom, a fleeting escape from a waking nightmare. The defining characteristic of the cellar was the damp. Being below ground level, moisture from the surrounding earth constantly leached through the walls, leaving them slick with slime and blooming with black furry mold. The air was thick, cold, and heavy with the smell of decay. These cellars were also prone to flooding. In a heavy rain, water would pour in from the street. But worse, because they were often located below the level of the area's primitive drainage systems, they would frequently flood with a vile, stinking mixture of rainwater and raw sewage from the overflowing cesspits outside. Families would wake to find a foot of liquid filth covering their floor, soaking their bedding, and contaminating their few possessions. They would have no choice but to live in this flooded state for days, their children playing on the bed to keep out of the sewage until it slowly, eventually, subsided. This was not a rare disaster. It was a regular, accepted part of life for the poorest of the urban poor. This was home. A dark, airless, flooded room. A perfect breeding ground for the diseases that would inevitably claim its inhabitants. The misery of the indoor space spilled out into the world beyond the front door, a world with no clear boundaries between inside and out. The concept of a street, as we might imagine it, a paved, clean, public thoroughfare, did not exist in the heart of these industrial slums. The space between the rows of back-to-back houses was typically a narrow, unpaved court or alleyway. This cramped, sunless canyon, perpetually in shadow from the looming brick walls, was the community's shared front yard, its children's playground, and, most dangerously, its open sewer and dumping ground. There was no system for waste collection. The very idea would have been a fantastical luxury. Every scrap of household refuse was simply thrown out into the central court to rot where it fell. Day after day, the inhabitants would add to the pile. The potato peelings, the animal bones from a rare meal, the ash from the fireplace, the contents of chamber pots. This refuse would accumulate in vast, sodden mounds, known as middens or dunghills, sometimes rising several feet high. These steaming heaps of decomposing organic matter became ecosystems of their own, attracting swarms of flies and armies of rats, which would scurry in and out of the houses, acting as yet another vector for disease. In wet weather, the court would transform into a treacherous quagmire, a thick, black, foul-smelling ooze that would suck at the shoes of those who tried to cross it. Children would play in this filth, their bare feet sinking into the muck. In dry weather, the waste would cake and turn to a fine, noxious dust, which would be whipped up by the wind, coating every surface and blowing back into the houses through the ill-fitting doors and windows, ensuring that the filth from outside was constantly being reunited with the grime inside. Navigating this space was a daily ordeal. It was the surface the children played on, the ground the workers had to wade through every morning on their way to the factory, and every night on their return. The filth was not just an inconvenience. It was a constant, intimate presence, a part of the very fabric of their world, a substance they walked on, breathed in, and lived amongst. The problem of human waste was even more acute and systematically ignored. There were no indoor toilets, no running water, no sewer systems. Instead, a single privy might be shared by dozens of households, sometimes serving over 100 people. This structure, a testament to the landlord's absolute indifference, was often little more than a crude wooden shed, its door broken or missing entirely, offering no privacy. It was erected over a large brick-lined pit dug into the ground. This was the cesspit, the sole repository for the community's excrement. The night soil men, the workers tasked with emptying these pits, were expensive, and their work was usually done only when the pit was so full as to be completely unusable. The landlord, viewing this as an unnecessary expense, would often allow the cesspit to go unemptied for a year or more. Consequently, the pits would fill up, and then they would overflow. Their putrid contents would seep out from under the privy door, a slow, viscous tide of human waste spilling across the courtyard to mix with the household refuse in the gutters. The stench, particularly in the heat of summer, was described by contemporary observers as overpowering and nauseating, a physical presence that clung to the back of the throat and caught in the lungs. But the smell, as horrific as it was the least of the dangers. The liquid filth from the overflowing cesspits would constantly leach into the surrounding soil, a slow, invisible poison seeping down into the earth, inch by inch, day by day. This poison had a destination, the community's water supply. The sole source of water for the inhabitants of these courts was often a single, communal hand pump, located right in the middle of the contaminated space, its iron handles slick with the grime of 100 unwashed hands. This pump drew its water not from a deep protected source, but from a shallow well, sunk only a few feet into the very same ground that was saturated with the contents of the leaking cesspits. The workers were, in effect, drinking their own, barely filtered sewage. The prevailing scientific theory of the day, the miasma theory, held that disease was spread by bad smells. It was a tragic misapprehension. While the stench was indeed horrendous, it was only a symptom. The true killer was invisible, odorless and tasteless, lurking in the very water that was meant to sustain life. This direct line from human waste to drinking water made catastrophic epidemics inevitable. An outbreak of cholera, when it struck, was a thing of terrifying speed and horror. A person could wake up healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The disease caused violent sickness and diarrhea, leading to such rapid and profound dehydration that the victim's skin would turn a deathly blue-grey. Their features would shrink and sharpen, and their eyes would sink deep into their sockets, creating a terrifying visage known as the cholera face. It created a panic that gripped the entire community, as neighbors watched neighbors die in agony within a matter of hours. Yet, even knowing the risk, they had no choice. There was no other water to drink, no other water to cook with. Every time a mother lowered a bucket to the pump to fetch water for her family, she was participating in a grim lottery, gambling with their lives. This was the kingdom of filth, a world where the ground underfoot, the air in the lungs, and the water on the tongue were all saturated with the agents of disease and decay. The assault on the human body did not end with the factory whistle or the contaminated water pump. It continued at the most fundamental level imaginable, in the desperate, daily struggle for sustenance. The industrial worker was not only poorly housed and overworked, they were systematically underfed. Hunger was not an occasional crisis. It was a chronic condition, a dull, persistent ache that was the constant companion to their exhaustion. The empty cupboard in their single damp room was as much a feature of their brutal reality as the roaring machine or the overflowing cesspit. Let us look upon the daily menu of a typical factory family. Breakfast, eaten in the pre-dawn gloom before the long walk to the mill, was often little more than a piece of dry bread and a mug of weak, sugarless tea. For those who could afford it, a bowl of thin, watery porridge or gruel might be prepared. The midday meal, consumed in the grime of the factory floor, was invariably more bread, perhaps with a sliver of hard, cheap cheese or an onion to provide some semblance of flavor. The main meal of the day, taken late at night after the return from work, was almost always a small portion of boiled potatoes. If the family was fortunate, these might be mashed with a knob of lard or a drip of bacon fat to make them more palatable. This was the diet, day after day, week after week. Its defining characteristic was a profound and soul-crushing monotony. Luxuries like meat were a rare event. perhaps a few scraps of bacon or offal once a week. Fresh fruit was an almost unheard of extravagance. Even milk was often too expensive for a family to buy regularly, meaning children were weaned onto the same starchy, nutrient-poor diet as their parents from a very young age. This was a diet composed almost entirely of carbohydrates, designed to provide the bare minimum of caloric energy needed to perform another day's labor. It was a fuel for the human machine, nothing more. It lacked the protein needed to build muscle, the fats needed for brain function, and the essential vitamins and minerals required to maintain a healthy body. Compounding this nutritional barrenness was the widespread and insidious practice of food adulteration. In the teeming, unregulated markets of the industrial cities, the pursuit of profit trumped all other concerns. The food sold to the poor was often not what it appeared to be. It was a common practice for bakers to add chalk, alum, or even plaster of Paris to their flour. This made the loaves heavier, allowing them to use less real flour. And the alum had the added effect of bleaching the bread, making it look whiter and finer than it was. Sugar was frequently bulked out with sand or dust. Tea leaves were mixed with dried leaves from other plants, and sometimes even colored with toxic substances like lead to give them a more appealing hue. Pepper was mixed with floor sweepings. Milk was watered down and then whitened with chalk. The worker, spending their hard-won pennies, was not only being starved of proper nutrition, they were often being actively poisoned by the very food they bought to survive. The physical consequences of this diet were devastating and plain to see on the streets of the slums. The lack of vitamin D from a sunless life, combined with a lack of calcium from a milkless diet, led to an epidemic of rickets among the children. This disease causes the bones to soften and deform under the body's weight. Children's legs would bow outwards or bend inwards. Their spines would curve. Their rib cages would become misshapen, creating a generation of people who were physically twisted and marked by their childhood hunger. Scurvy, a disease we now associate with sailors on long voyages, was rampant in the slums. A lack of vitamin C meant that connective tissues would break down, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and open sores that would not heal. This chronic malnutrition was a silent partner to the infectious diseases detailed earlier. A body weakened by hunger had no chance of fighting off a tuberculosis or cholera infection. The two forces worked in a grim synergy. The poor diet destroyed the immune system, and the unsanitary environment provided the pathogens to invade it. This reality was reflected in the very stature of the population. Military recruitment records from the era show that the average height of young men from the industrial districts was significantly lower than that of their counterparts from rural areas. They were a population physically stunted by their diet, their growth sacrificed at the altar of industrial efficiency. This state of near starvation was the ultimate injustice. These were the people at the heart of the wealthiest, most powerful empire on earth. Their labor was creating unprecedented fortunes. They loaded the ships with goods to be sent around the globe. They forged the rails that connected continents. They wove the cloth that dressed the world. Yet they returned home to an empty cupboard. Their hunger was not a natural disaster or a passive state of poverty. It was an active and necessary component of the system. By keeping wages at the absolute minimum required for survival, the factory owners ensured their workforce remained dependent and desperate. The empty plate of the worker was a direct reflection of the full coffers of the master. For the modern mind, the week is defined by a rhythm of labor and leisure. We endure the work week, sustained by the promise of the weekend, a period of rest, recreation, and personal freedom. This concept, so fundamental to our lives, was utterly alien to the Victorian factory worker. Their life was a seamless, unbroken cycle of exhausting toil and collapsed recovery, a grim, binary state that offered no true respite. The factory's dominion over their time did not end when they walked out its gates. Its shadow loomed over every hour of their existence. Their one day of freedom from the machine was Sunday. But to call this a day of rest is a profound misnomer. For the women of the household in particular, Sunday was often the most strenuous and labor-intensive day of the week. It was the only opportunity to perform the essential domestic tasks that were impossible during the 6 long days of factory work. It was a day of frantic, desperate battle against the encroaching filth and decay of their lives. Imagine the scene. A woman, already exhausted from her own 60-hour week in the mill, rises on Sunday morning. Her first task is the washing. There is no washing machine, no hot running water. She must haul buckets of cold water from the communal pump, heat it laboriously over the small, smoky fireplace, and then, by hand, scrub the family's clothes in a tin tub. This would include the clothes they wore to the factory, stiff with grime, grease, and sweat. Her knuckles would be raw, her back aching from stooping over the tub for hours. The wet clothes would then have to be hung to dry inside their single, damp room, filling the already stagnant air with a cold, clammy humidity and a smell of wet wool. Wet. Sunday was also the day for mending. The family's clothes were precious and had to be made to last as long as possible. She would spend hours by the dim light of the window, darning socks, patching trousers, and sewing up rips and tears. It was the only chance to perform basic household maintenance, to try and scrub the floor, to fight back against the ever-present grime. It was a day not of leisure, but of a different, equally exhausting kind of labor. For the men, Sunday was often a day of near total physical collapse. After 6 consecutive days of 14-hour shifts, their bodies were simply shattered. Many would spend the majority of the day in a state of semi-comatose exhaustion, lying on their cot or slumped on a stool, trying to gather the physical strength necessary to face the week to come. There was no energy for hobbies, for sport, for a walk in the countryside, even if such a thing were accessible. The popular Victorian middle-class image of the respectable working man spending his Sunday in church followed by a wholesome family meal was a fantasy that bore no resemblance to the reality of life in the industrial slums. This physical collapse was often accompanied by a desire for mental escape, driving many men to the pub or gin palace. For a few hours, the camaraderie and the alcohol could provide a fleeting illusion of freedom and community, a brief respite from the anxieties of home and work. But this came at a cost, both to the family's meager budget and to the man's own health, often leaving him even less prepared for the coming week. The most insidious aspect of this one stolen day, however, was its psychological weight. The freedom of Sunday was a cruel illusion, for it was constantly and completely overshadowed by the looming certainty of Monday morning. The anxiety was ever present. Every tick of the clock on Sunday was a tick closer to the inevitable, dreaded shriek of the factory whistle. The brief respite from the noise and danger of the mill only served to highlight its misery in sharper contrast. The feeling of the body slowly knitting itself back together was tainted by the knowledge that it was about to be torn down all over again. There was no true escape, no sanctuary where the factory could be forgotten. Its reach extended beyond its walls and into the workers' home, into their food, into their relationships, and even into their one supposed day of rest. The system was perfectly designed to keep them in a state of perpetual motion, either in the frantic activity of labor or the desperate scramble of domestic chores and recovery. It ensured that their life was a complete and unbroken cycle of suffering, a wheel from which they could never step off. The dawn of Monday was not a new beginning, but simply the return of the same unending, brutal reality. We have walked through the furnace. We have stood in the shadow of the machine, breathed its poisoned air, and followed the worker home into the suffocating gloom of the slum. Now, at the end of our journey, we must take stock. We must look upon the landscape of this existence in its entirety and reckon with the complete portrait of a life consumed by the engines of progress. We began our story inside the factory walls, a kingdom ruled by the tyranny of the clock. We saw how human life was bent and broken to fit the relentless, mechanical rhythm of the machines. A 14-hour day, 6 days a week, was not a measure of time, but a sentence of perpetual exhaustion. We witnessed the constant, immediate threat of the factory floor, the forest of unguarded belts waiting to snag a piece of clothing, the churning gears ready to crush a careless hand, the flying shuttle that could maim or blind in an instant. This was a world where the human body was the most fragile and disposable component. We saw how this physical danger was enforced by a system of absolute power. We saw the list of arbitrary rules and the merciless fines that could wipe out a day's wages for the crime of being human, for speaking, for resting, for being late. We saw the overseer with his leather strap, the ever-present agent of fear, whose job was not to lead, but to intimidate, to push the exhausted bodies of men, women, and children beyond their breaking points. We learned of the truck system, that masterpiece of economic bondage that trapped families in a cycle of debt, paying for overpriced, substandard goods with a private currency that chained them to their master. We saw the wall of silence, the blacklisting of dissenters, and the violent suppression of protest that rendered the worker voiceless and utterly alone. Beyond the factory walls, we witnessed a war being waged on the body by the environment itself. We saw how the factory floor was a perfect breeding ground for disease, its hot, stagnant air thick with the dust that caused brown lung and the invisible germs of tuberculosis that passed from worker to worker. We then followed the worker home into the purpose-built slum, a world without clean air, clean water, or sanitation. We descended into the damp, dark cellar dwellings and walked through the unpaved courts, thick with overflowing cesspits and rotting refuse. We stood by the communal water pump, the fountainhead of the community that was, in reality, a primary vector for cholera and typhoid, delivering death in every bucket. We have now seen this life in full. Let us hold this image in our minds for a moment. Consider the individual at the heart of our story. He wakes in the dark, in a cold, damp room he shares with his entire family. He is already tired. He is chronically underfed, his body weakened by a diet of bread and potatoes. He wades through the filth of his courtyard and walks to the factory, where he will spend the next 14 hours in a deafening, dangerous, and poisoned environment. He is watched constantly, afraid to speak, afraid to slow down. He is haunted by the memory of the man he saw killed by a machine last year. He returns home in the dark, too tired to speak, to a meal of boiled potatoes. He will fall into a brief, troubled sleep, only to be woken by the knocker-up before the sun has risen. His one day of rest will be spent in exhausted collapse, overshadowed by the anxiety of the coming week. This is not an exaggeration. This is not a fiction. This was the lived, daily, brutal reality for millions of human beings. This was the true price of the age of invention. Now let us return to where we began, to the Crystal Palace, to that glittering, triumphant monument of glass and iron, bursting with the marvels of a new age. It stands as the enduring symbol of the Victorian era, an emblem of progress, invention, and boundless optimism. But after our journey through the darkness, we can no longer see it in the same light. The gleaming facade has been rendered transparent, and we can now see the ghostly figures of the men, women, and children whose lives were shattered to build it. The wealth that funded that great exhibition, the power that drove its steam hammers, the very iron that formed its skeleton. It was all purchased with the suffering we have just witnessed. The chasm between the myth of Victorian progress and the reality of the lives that fueled it is a void too vast to comprehend. It was not progress for all. It was a violent transfer of health, time, and life itself from the millions who had nothing to the few who had everything. And yet, their suffering was not entirely in vain. The world we inhabit today, with its standards of safety, its concepts of workers' rights, and its expectations of a life beyond mere survival, was not given to us. It was not the inevitable result of benevolent progress. It was forged in the fire of this brutal reality. It was built upon the foundations of their sacrifice, a testament to the slow, agonizing struggle of those who fought back. Consider the simple, profound pleasure of a weekend. That 2-day period of rest was not a gift from employers. It was won by generations of activists and unionists who faced down the tyranny of the 7-day working week. The 8-hour workday, a standard we now take for granted, was the rallying cry for marchers who were beaten, arrested, and sometimes killed for daring to suggest that a third of a person's day should belong to them. Every time you walk past a machine and see a protective guard over its gears, you are seeing a memorial to the thousands of workers who were mangled and killed by unguarded machinery. Every time a worker receives compensation for an injury sustained on the job, it is a victory born from the suffering of the disabled men who were discarded like broken tools. The right to form a union, the very concept of collective bargaining, was paid for by the blood of protesters and the sacrifice of blacklisted organizers. The laws that forbid a child of 9 from working a 14-hour shift exist only because of the stunted, broken bodies of the children who were fed into the factories. Even the basic amenities of our cities, the clean water that flows from our taps, the sewage systems that run beneath our streets, are monuments to the countless victims of cholera and typhoid, whose deaths finally forced a reluctant society to confront the lethal consequences of its own neglect. These are not just features of the modern world. They are the hard-won answers to the horrors we have chronicled. And so, we are left with a debt. We live in a house built upon the bones of these forgotten people. The conveniences of our lives, the very safety we feel in our workplaces and our communities, were financed by their misery. The next time you enjoy a day of rest, or turn on a clean tap, or feel secure in the knowledge that your child will go to a school instead of a factory, perhaps take a moment to remember the true price of that privilege. Forget the tales of glorious invention and national pride. The true story of the Industrial Revolution is not found in the museums or the history books. It is written in the soot-blackened lungs of a child sent crawling under a running machine. It is etched into the mangled hand of a worker caught in a loom. And it is heard in the deafening, soul-crushing roar of the factory floor, a sound that for millions was both their master and their tomb. We have ventured into the furnace, and we must never forget what we have seen.